And do you have the API token for the captioners?
Not yet.
Did Trustee Hoffman get pulled in?
Professor Tapia, muy buenos días. Welcome.
Buenos dias. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good
Oh,
to-
hey.
Good
Professor
to see all of
Tapia.
you. Good morning.
Did Hoffman get pulled in?
I think so. Unless there's another Andra. There
Am
we
I
go.
here?
Yes,
We see.
but we are live, folks.
Because Andrew will never let me live it down if she's not.
Oh, no, I didn't need to be on the panel. I'm just was waiting in the waiting room for the webinar to start. Thank you.
Mr. Vela's here too. Trustee Vela, good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
We have similar backgrounds, Professor Tapia.
Yes, the books.
But I do have Zapata in the background, just to be clear,
Very good.
It's appropriate for the discussion.
Yes, it sure is.
Oh, and you a good Chicano household always has to have Fernando Valenzuela also.
There you go.
Now we're complete.
Chancellor, I believe we have everyone on the webinar if you'd like to begin.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and begin. Well, good morning, everybody. Muy buenos dias to all. Welcome to this webinar titled Latinos at LACCD, Data Implications for Policy and Practice. Very happy that all of you are joining us this morning. We expect to have a very lively conversation with you all today. This is intended to be an interactive discussion about Latinos at LACCD. So to kick us off this morning, I'm very pleased that we have several members of our board who are here with us today. And last night, the board elected Mr. Steve Vettis as its board president. So we'd like to extend welcome to you all this morning. Mr. Vettis?
Thank you, Chancellor. Good morning, everyone. And it's my sincere pleasure to be here and participate here in such an important and critical conversation about essentially what represents the future of Los Angeles and the present of Los Angeles, and understanding how Latinos and the Latino community together have an impact on this campus, and certainly what we look towards for the future of success. I'm really proud to have had a chance to be part of a wonderful meeting last night where we re-elected and swore in several colleagues, and they marked the face of a new LACCD board, and certainly a new LACCD attitude in terms of collaboration and working together. And I wanted to recognize them here in this, from a not so late of a meeting last night to an early morning this morning. Obviously, this is a group of trustees ready to get ready to work. But I wanted to acknowledge Trustee Andrew Hoffman, who is our recent past president of the Board of Trustees, and much of this work to get to this point comes under her leadership and under her support. So Andra, we can always count on her for the U.S. flag background. Essential to our meetings when we pledge, because all the rest of us don't seem to have that in the background here. But and also wanted to recognize Trustee David Vela, who is our second vice president, and hails from the wonderful community of East LA and Bell Gardens in particular. So like a few of us on this board of trustees had a chance to grow up in a Latino household and in a Latino community, and have very similar experiences to many of our students that are coming to our school here today. So welcome, Second Vice President David Vela, I think the spear and the impetus for driving the conversation about data in our campuses is our newly elected first vice president, Gabriel Bualna. And Gabriel, thank you for keeping this topic pressed before us. And I know you worked very closely with trustee Mike Fong in your institutional effectiveness committee. He, as well as you, are very sensitive to understanding data and understanding our communities of color and what data means and what it could mean in terms of setting the future agenda. So with that, this is the new board, this is the new approach, the new attitude, and I'm excited, and I know all of them are very excited to get going and get started. So with that, Chancellor, hand it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Veres. Appreciate extending the welcome on behalf of the Board of Trustees. Trustees, welcome. Muy buenos dias to all of you. Thank you for being here. I also want to extend a warm welcome to one of our key faculty members in the district who will be assisting us today as well as a thought discussant, a participant, and engaging in the conversation, and that is Dr. Beatriz Tapia, who serves as chair of Chicano Studies at East LA College. Welcome, Professor Tapia. Happy that you're here.
Thank you. Just real quick, not doctor, but professor. Thank you.
Profesora, muy bienvenida.
Gracias.
Well, let me give you all a sense of what we have in store for today. I'll provide comments in just a few moments to provide an overview of the discussion that's been informed by recent discussions that we've had at LACCD. And then Dr. Ryan Corner will review lots of data on Latinos at LACCD. We're going to disaggregate data, look at trends, and then get to the third part of the conversation, which is really a dialogue and exchange with you, the audience, with our trustees, with other stakeholders about what the program and policy implications are for LACCD. What are some initial ideas? It's intended to be a beginning conversation, one that has continued over time, and that will continue now into the future. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and give some introductory comments as we look at our wonderful district that's there. First, let me start with some fast facts about Latinos at the LACCD or Latinos in the country. Just let me give you 4. And this is from the Pew Research Center. You can look this up to get a lot more, but just to give you a sense of the national context. First, the US Latino population reached 60.6 million in 2019, 60.6 million. That's up from 50.7 million in 2010. And just imagine this, in 1970, it was 9.6 million. So you could see the tremendous growth of the Latino population here in the United States. Good news, the second fact, the share of US Latinos with college experience has increased since 2010. About 41% of US Latino adults 25 and older had at least some college in 2018, and that's up from 36% in 2010. Those who have a bachelor's degree, and we need more for sure, or more education also increased during this period from 13% to 17%. So that's you see a slow trend, including the rural community colleges have a reason to do with that. Not enough, not high enough, but certainly moving in the right direction. 2 more facts, and this relates to the discussion of disaggregation. People of Mexican origin account for slightly over 60%. That's about 37 million of the country's overall Latino population as of 2018. And we're going to get into how that looks at LACCD. So we talk about Latinos as an inclusive term. Mexican origin folks are about 60% of that nationally, and you'll see what that is at LACCD. And then lastly, related to that, the fastest population growth among US Latinos has come among those with origins in Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Honduras. And again, that has implications to our LACCD population as well. So as we look at the national discussion and demography and the trends that are going in a particular way, let's now start to drill it down to LACCD and the context that we find ourselves in right now. In particular, the context of social justice, racial equity, criminal justice reform, and how that's continuing to penetrate what I would describe as the consciousness of this nation. The president-elect talked about the soul of this nation. And if indeed we at LACCD believe that we are founded on educational excellence, on justice, on opportunity, access, and if we're dedicated to these principles, then our colleges like LACCD, we must lead by example. And I've shared this before, and I'll say it in this context. Leading by example at LACCD means making structural and permanent change to root out the ill effects of racism and bias from our classrooms, our curriculum, and our workplace. We still have a lot of work to do in this particular space, but it is something that is articulated in the board adopted framework for racial equity and indeed the social justice. So our engagement today, what I would simply describe as an encuentro, fuels this movement, this movimiento. And it's my hope that the discussion today will lead to further dialogue that will ultimately translate to action steps and to commitments, and to those that will allow our organization to build an anti-racist organizational capacity and resilience, and move towards this sometimes elusive commodity, this elusive place that we call a socially and racially just academic community. And it's important to remember there were the echoes of the 1968 East LA walkouts, where they demanded culturally relevant curriculum, the racial diversification of faculty to improve jobs in the economy and opportunity. Were the echoes of the 1965 and 1968 Watts Rebellion that demanded jobs and equality and opportunity and the end to racism. And as a matter of fact, our LA Southwest College was born out of that rebellion, out of that notion of justice and need for greater opportunities. Were there echoes of the 1968 Third World Liberation Front, which was a multiracial coalition at SF State that staged the longest student strike that led to a set of demands that firmly established the first ethnic studies program in this country. And it was the spark that was needed to diversify the curriculum. You saw the following year, UC Berkeley was established, and by the mid-1970s, dozens of ethnic studies programs as legitimate academic disciplines emerged across this country at major universities and some community colleges. That, in my view, however, has stalled in the last several years, and something for us to pick up in the latter part of our conversation. So as I conclude here are the prompts. I want all of our audience to think about this. And this is right in the pitch right before we get to the data, the deep data that Dr. Korn is going to walk us through. Here are some questions to think about in the context of this seminar, this webinar, this forum. And you could slot in other communities, African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, et cetera, into this conversation, LGBTQ. But does having Latino faculty and staff improve the educational outcomes of Latino students? Does having Chicano Latino studies as part of our curriculum, as a general education requirement, improve the performance of students, improve the climate for students? Does having a higher number of Latino faculty, staff, and administrators at LACCD improve the campus climate for Latinos? And if your answers are yes to all of those, how do we know? How do we measure? What's the right number? Is it representative proportionality? Is that the goal? Or is it just as many as one can get? So this is how we're going to start looking at the data of proportionality. Who's in our ranks, where we are strong, where we are weak in this. So those are kind of the types of questions that I want us to think about as we move through this discussion this morning. This is our LACCD footprint. It covers about 36 major cities and unincorporated areas. It right now is about 5.2 million residents. And we'll see what the 2020 census has in store for us. But you could see this massive impact that we have that is called LACCD. And the board and our administrators, we have a very, very aggressive agenda to ensure that every person in our service area has the chance for an affordable, accessible, high quality education that leads to higher educational, economic, and social mobility. So that's the goal, that's the day, that's the context. Let's get started. let me pitch it now to Dr. Ryan Corner. Ryan, will you walk us through this? And you can see there, just as we finish here, the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color. This is the narrative that's been discussed all around the country. But go ahead, pick it up from there, Dr. Corner, and walk us through the fast facts and take it forward from here. Thank you, sir.
Chancellor, can I interrupt one quick second? And I know this meeting is essentially posted as an informative meeting, but just for the sake of a legal standing, since there are four, a majority of the board is constituted on this meeting, and it's not an agendized Board of Trustees meeting. I do want to just let the public know that this is an informational purpose. There isn't going to be any board decisions made here, and that if there are things that come forward as policies, that they will be appropriately agendized according to the Brown Act and the public meetings. But it's such a great interest from our board that you have more than a majority actually visiting and watching. But I do want to make sure that we're in safe legal harbor with the rules that we have to follow.
Thank you, sir, for mentioning that and putting that on the record. Okay, Dr. Corner.
So good morning, everyone. I hope everybody had their coffee because we're going to dive straight into data. Just a few facts about our district for those who maybe only have a college view or who have not had experience with our district as a whole. We serve about 230,000 students annually, about 130,000 each semester. 51% of our students report income that are at or below the poverty line. And so I think that's one of the concepts that we definitely focus on when we look at our equity and our racial equity efforts. LACCD disperses almost $250 million in financial aid annually to help support these students. And I would say that it's not nearly enough to really do what students need to be able to be successful. Last year, we conferred over 30,000 awards to students across our 9 colleges. And this has been a continuous trend, which has led to a doubling of awards conferred over about the last 6 years. In terms of diversity, LACCD is one of the leading educators of Latino and African American students, educating twice as many Latino and African American students as all UC campuses combined. And so definitely we find our center in this discussion of equity and of diversity. But today in particular, we wanted to talk about what it looks like in terms of our Latino students. For the district, 61% of our students self-identify as being Latino. And this is an important figure because it shows exactly the scope of our Latino population across the district, but it hides some of the elements of what it means to be Latino in our district. It creates a monolithic view of the Latino population where in fact there's a great deal of diversity. You'll see through the slides that we have some ability to look at this diversity, and then we have some future plans to get even more refined to those populations that were mentioned by the Chancellor as some of the fastest growing in our country. Currently, what we know is that 65% of our Latino students indicate or self-identify as being Mexican or of Mexican origins. 21% of our Latino students identify as being Central American, 3% as South American, and 11% as other. You'll see that in our future data, that other will become much more refined. But this is very important as we look at what this means for our general student population. The Latino figure of 61% is the predominant figure that people see. But in reality, this is what our demographic really looks like. When you look at our entirety of our student population, almost 40% of our student base is of Mexican origins. And that is a tremendous figure. And you can see that 12.8% of our student base is Central American. That makes Central American actually the 3rd highest student demographic in our entire district. Higher than most of the demographics that we usually have when we look at less disaggregated data. These are important elements because we want to make sure that we fully understand the populations that we are serving and have a conversation about how we can serve each population better. When we look at how we rank as it relates to LA County on these demographics, you can see that we have historically and continue to be more represented in Latino and in the subcategories of Latino than the general county demographics. You can see that the county is 48.6% Latino to our 61%, and that trend continues across each of the other categories as well. What we know is that this has been a trend that has been growing for more than 25 years. In 1995, 40% of our student population was Latino, and that represented about 40,000 students. We have now more than doubled that figure to over 80,000 Latino students, and we see that it represents 61% of our overall student body. This is a figure that will likely continue to grow as the demographics of the county continue to change. In terms of our colleges, there is a spread. All of our colleges are classified as Hispanic serving institutions based on the number of Latino students that they have in their student body. But we have a high mark with ELAC and Mission, nearly 80%. And our lowest proportion of Latino students, you can see at Southwest, Pierce, and West. But even at these lower proportioned, it's nearly 50%. So in general, very few of our colleges are below the 50% mark, and when they are very close to that marker. In terms of gender, we see a standard trend that we've seen across our general population of more females than males inside of our student base. The 58 to 42 is pretty consistent with our general student population, and we don't see a huge difference there. I want to point out that we have a small number of students classifying themselves as non-binary. That is a new data element, and we will continue to see this grow as students have the opportunity to identify their gender in the way that they feel most comfortable. And so you will see this as an element that's going to be added as we look at gender statistics across our district. In terms of age, we do see a younger student base with our Latino students. Our general population has 28% under the age of 20 to the nearly 33% that we see with our Latino students. The category of 20 to 24 is about 26.5% in our general population compared to 29% for our Latino students. So we do see a trend amongst the Latino population to be younger and more traditional aged in our student population. We still do have quite an age range. You can see that about 40% are over 25 years of age, and it continues all the way to about 5% over the age of 50. So while there is still that spread, we definitely have a higher representation of younger students amongst our Latino population. This is an important element when we look at undocumented students in our district. Undocumented students make up 4.5% of our credit population, nearly 7,000 students, but almost a third of our non-credit population. What we see in these mix of different populations is that the non-credit students predominantly are those that will not qualify for AB 540 or for other in-state tuition programs. And so they avail themselves of the non-credit programs that we have. But we rarely look at it in this terms. And so I always like to highlight the proportionality that we have here with our non-credit students. Not all undocumented students are from a Latino background, 82%, and then the remaining 18% is spread across many different countries throughout the world. Turning now from demographics to success, the district began a 3-year cohort, a Milestone Project, we called it, about 3 years ago, where we started to track students across their career, looking at milestones such as completion of English and math, all the way to degree completion. Whereas the state likes to look at a 6-year completion rate, we're holding ourselves to a 3-year completion rate, that our students have the opportunity to graduate in a timely manner. The benefit of this is that it allows us to disaggregate on a multitude of different variables so that we can identify gaps and actually start to intervene where we see gaps need to be corrected. This is what it looks like for our 2017 cohort of all students. You can see it tracks all the way from fall to fall persistence, that first year retention figure, through our basic skills completion of transfer level English and math, all the way to degree and certificate completion. What we see is some very small gaps when we compare all students to our Latino students. You see that the degree completion drops to 10.5 from 10.5% to 9.8. And you can see that the drop off really begins with the completion of math. You see higher rates in the completion of English and also in the first year persistence, with students retaining, Latino students retaining more frequently in that first year than the rest of the student population. Now, what is important to note is that because we are 61% Latino, even this small gap is very meaningful and very important to correct. Because the 61% of students that identify as Latino will draw the average of our overall student body towards them. And so it's very important to look at these gaps, even when they're only 1 point, as something that needs to be seriously corrected. In addition, we've been able to disaggregate amongst Latino students to look at the 4 categories that we saw in our demographics. And here is where we see a bit more of an equity gap and an opportunity to investigate what types of interventions we can actually have that can be more specifically tailored to the students that are struggling. With degree completion, you can see our high point with our South American students at 15.1%, and the biggest gap being between South American and Mexican students at 9.4%. That's more than a 5-point gap, and that's something that would need to be addressed. And without looking at the data in this light, where you can see these subcategories within the Latino classification, you might not know that there's this specific issue that needs to be dealt with. And so when we get to data implications and the conversation on policy and direction of where we want to go, this is an important fact to really focus on, is the within group equity gaps that we see, and what do we have that exists on our campus to address these student populations. Going back to the demographic of our AB 540 students, and in this case, we do mean AB 540 because our credit population is traditionally AB 540 if they're undocumented. We do see actually a benefit. The AB 540 students complete at a higher rate and have actually higher success on each of these elements, beginning with persistence from fall to fall and tracking all the way through to certificate and degree completion. In 2017, we launched our LA College Promise program. This was something that was invested in and made a priority by our board and supported by LA Mayor Garcetti, which allowed students to come to school for their first year for free if they agreed to be a full-time student. Because this is now our 3 years out, we actually have data on our program. And this is the difference between Latino students that were involved in the LA College Promise program and those who were not. You can see that allowing students to be full-time, making sure their tuition's covered, the wraparound supports and other elements have had quite an impact on student success, with the difference being 8.3 degree completion compared to 14.3. It's also important to note that the LA College Promise as a whole in 2017 was 72% Latino. So more representation amongst the College Promise students than we even saw in our general student population. This gives us a sense of some areas that may represent good elements in terms of intervention, but it will be important to really dive into this data and to recognize what could be most specifically used to support students in all cases. Now, in the future, we will have the ability to disaggregate even more fully amongst our student populations. As the Chancellor had indicated, we do see a diversity of immigration flowing into our country. And we still, when we look at county data and other data sets, have this monolithic Latino category that does not look at the diversity of the group as of itself. These are the categories that are now being collected. They began to be collected in winter of 2020. So we don't yet have enough data to really put this into our general demographic information, but we will soon. We'll see that with fall 21, we will likely be able to look at our entering class using these demographics. And as we move forward, we'll be able to have our general population showing where these demographics are. I do want to point out at the end, inclusive of the Latino categories, there are also 115 indigenous tribes that can be self-identified by those who go through the application process now. This was really important because the category of Native American tended to not really allow us to see who that population was. So now let's shift from the trends in students to the trends in employees. This is the data over about the last 20 years. This is state data. You can see it on the state MIS data mart. And you can see that the proportion of Latino employees has increased from 16% to 20% over the last 19 years. That's at a time when our student population has increased from 45% to 61%. And so we see that not only do we have a large representation issue when we compare the student body to our employees, but we aren't keeping pace with the increases in the changing demographics across our county and across our student base. The line you can see is much steeper for our student change of demographics than it is for our employees. When we look at our employees, there are differences amongst our colleges, with East LA and Mission having greater representation of Latino employees, and then the other colleges all ranging between 15 and 21% around that median that we saw. Within the employee classifications, we see that the highest point of representation is actually with classified staff at almost 29%, and then followed by educational administrators, which is at 28%. Where we see less representation is with our tenured and tenure track faculty and with our adjuncts. Now, I do want to note that there are unidentified ethnicities. People are not forced to declare their ethnicities. And so there are groupings of unidentified employees, and adjuncts tends to be an area where we have greater unidentified. But amongst the identified ethnicities, these are what the proportionality are. And you can see that the trends mimic across the different groups what we saw with the general employee population. Some increases, you can see that we have about a 9% gain in classified employees, and you can see that we had a 14-point gain in educational administrators and more flatness amongst tenure track and adjunct faculty. So moving forward, I think it's very important to say that there are some key findings here that we will review, but moving forward, we know that this is not the end of all the data that we need to look at. This is, as the Chancellor said, a starting point for this conversation. And I do hope that the conversation that we have through our Q&A and our panelists today will give us an opportunity to refine the data and really look at what we need to do to have a better environment for our students. Some suggestions from our research teams in terms of what we can do better. Number one, more detailed employee demographics. We need to have a breakdown that actually matches the students. Right now, we do not have the subcategories that you saw among students, and that's an important exploration that we really need to talk about. We also need to look at exploration of within the categories of employment where we see the diversity and inclusion better, and where we see that we might have some different elements. So I know we have Beatrice here as part of our panelists, and the Chicano Studies program within East LA College has 9 tenured or tenure track faculty members. That means that her department alone represents about 3% of all tenured or tenure track Latinos in the district. That's a heavy concentration in one area. And it leads us to ask the question of what does the concentration look like in other areas, and what type of investigations really need to be done to understand those hiring results. We do need to look at a review of in-group success. We saw that there were gaps between our self-identified Mexican and South American students. What is different about the experiences of those two student groups that we could have an intervention that would assist students in being more successful? Those are important questions that we need to ask and we need to investigate. We need to finish the implementation of our detailed student demographics. That is clear. We need to find out more about our students so that we can better understand. Even the groupings that we have now with those 4 categories hide the in-group differences that could be meaningful to our success interventions. We need to look at the geographic mapping of our county populations. You saw county demographics, you saw district and college demographics, but the question becomes, when we look at our colleges situated within the communities that they serve, are we meeting those needs? Do we see the demographic representation that would be expected for those communities within the general LA County, and make sure that we have that alignment? Lastly, I do think that there is a need to find out a survey for the specific needs of Latino population. When we look at these different categories that we have within our demographics, it's important to ask students, it's important to ask faculty and staff, what can be done to better improve our success? So just a summary of what the data represented before we go into more of the policy discussions. There were some key findings in this data. We know that Latinos make up the largest and fastest growing population at LACCD. And we also demonstrated that Latino students are a diverse population, made up of different ethnic groups within, made up of different genders and age groups. And we need to make sure that we take that in-group difference into account when we have these conversations. In the Latino success, we see a small but meaningful equity gap. And I do want to point that out. I mean, most institutions would say, oh, a 1-point equity gap, we're almost there. We're not almost there. Because our student body is 61% Latino, the average is being drawn straight there. In order to really make sure that we have success, we need to look at that gap very seriously and make sure that none exists. In addition, just the numbers in general need to improve across the board. We need to do this by looking at the in-group equity gaps. We need to make sure that within the Latino population, we are taking into account the differing experiences that groups have. In terms of employee representation, it does not match the community or the student demographic. The data are pretty clear that we have a gap there. The long-term trends in Latino employees do not match the trend data that we see in terms of the student population. The growth lines are just not equitable. And so that needs to be something that we build into our discussions on racial consciousness and what it means. There is much data out there that suggests that representation is a critical element to student success. That the more often that students see themselves in the people that are on the campus in terms of employee and faculty groups, the more likely they are to be successful. And I think that this is a really important sounding off point to have that conversation and to really understand what the data represent in terms of where we need to go as a district and how do we get there. And so with that, Chancellor, I will hand back to you and move to moderating the question and answer session as you begin the policy discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And there's lots and lots of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Let's get to some of these here before we, as we move into the last part and the most important part, perhaps, now that the context has been set, let's see if we can get some responses to some of these questions. And Dr. Corner, the first one relates to undocumented students and whatnot. And we serve, as has been shared, in many forums, more undocumented students than the entire UC and CSU systems combined. That's why this district has taken a very strong policy position, both at the state and at the federal level, to support our undocumented students. Now, with that being said, there was a question is how do we protect the identity of our undocumented students against, the kinds of forces that might want to use that information inappropriately or for whatever reasons. How do we protect the student data for undocs, Dr. Corner?
So one of the ways that we've protected it is by consolidating how one would gain access to student data. If there are any requests from the federal government as it relates to student data, inclusive of any of the undocumented students, it does have to go through my office as the custodian of record. Any request that would involve listing undocumented students, the board has already passed a resolution that we will not abide by. We do not retain those lists, and we do not have that as an opportunity for people to request.
Mm-hmm.
So we take that data very seriously, and we are well prepared that if there were any such requests from the federal government, that we would immediately coordinate with our Office of General Counsel to make sure that we protect our students to the fullest ability that we're allowed to.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'll pose this question out perhaps to our trustees who are engaged in local, state, and federal policy discussions. And this is not LACCD policy, but this is one reflecting on Proposition 16, which would have essentially reversed the Proposition 209 law that passed back in 1995 or so, that essentially disallows the use of race and gender considerations in public hiring, public contracting, and in university admissions. So the question was, this is a tool, clearly a tool that was used before to have a race conscious, gender conscious hiring, contracting, and university admissions policy. The question was, why do we think that Proposition 16 failed in the public vote this last November of 2020? Any thoughts from our panelists on that?
I can take that on.
Thank you, Dr. Wilman.
If you look at the percentage, Latinos, I believe, are around 30% of voters in the state, right? I think it could have, the amount of white voters, I believe, was around 54, 55. Steve Edis, Trustee Edis knows the exact numbers. African Americans supported it in large part, but when you get to the numbers of Latinos who supported the initiative, it was tepid. And I think in looking, and if a coalition is going to be built around passing an initiative like affirmative action, Latino support has to be around 65 to 75%. And that means that you have to have a narrative that includes the marketing, communication, and Latinos understanding. LMU and the Center for the Study of Los Angeles did a study, or I believe it was Latino Decision. They both get along, and Fernando Guerra might be on this call. The more Latinos understood that affirmative action included Latinos and has always included Latinos since 1968, the more Latinos supported it. But Latinos did not have that information. Some people might say, well, it's in the handouts, whatever. No, but the marketing, the outreach. So, my concern over Prop 16 was the actual organization of it that really didn't include a solid Latino thinking process behind it in order to get to that 65%. It wasn't Latinos because that we could blame and say, oh, it was them. Once Latinos knew what it was about, and it's up to those that control the narrative through the campaigns to get that information out. That's my take on it.
I can actually add a little bit to what Trustee Buena just added on the political side. So, Trustee Buena is absolutely right. What you had here was, and you had a similar situation when we were looking to repeal the ban on bilingual education, and that was actually led in part by, at that time, the Latino caucus in the state legislature. And what happened this time around is you had a concentrated political effort, and you had actually more money than when we repealed the ban on bilingual education. It had that proposition had only about $3 million on the Yes campaign. And this one actually had over $23 million. It was a consultant that was referred by the African American caucus. And the Latino caucus, was a big part of it as far as raising money as well, as you can imagine. So it really did boil down to the communication. And one of the things that they did different, and Steve, you could weigh in here as well, is on the repealing the bilingual education proposition, they went to the media airwaves. They did a lot of radio in Latino markets in particular. And on this one, they didn't. And so you saw the power of, for example, and we all know the morning radio shows, the Latino ones, right? And that didn't happen with Prop 16. On the side of, as chair of the Legislative and Public Affairs Committee all last year, we were extremely involved in advocating for it. As a matter of fact, and Chancellor, you remember the phone calls that we did, in the midnight hour to have ACA 5, which was a precursor to the proposition, get approved in the state legislature, and then we didn't really hear from the campaign back to LACCD, which was a little bit interesting. And so, I think, to Trustee Buena's point, if it's not communicated through where, or at least continue to be communicated over and over, you're going to see something that perhaps isn't going to do as well. And so, comparing it to, again, previous state initiatives that were repealed, and, the type of communication wasn't as robust. And, one can argue back and forth what the medium was that was used, but there's certainly, at least, and even as somebody that was heavily involved in the advocacy of it through LACCD, I really didn't see a lot of the campaign. And again, I'll leave it up to my colleague, President Mendez, who works in the state legislature, but that's what I saw on our side.
Mm-hmm.
I've been called out a couple times here, so I'll say a few words on Prop 16. I'd like to actually take back to SCA 5, which was a legislative proposal by Senator Hernandez a few years back. That was actually met by, and it was the legislative attempt to, the initial attempt to take on Prop 209 and repeal Prop 209. It didn't pass out of the legislature. And actually there was Democratic members of the legislature at the time who felt very uncomfortable with it. And there was particularly an aggressive stance by the Asian American caucus who had indicated that they were feeling some sentiment of negativity and pushback. And certainly the biggest question and the biggest prize of using affirmative action in the state beyond our hiring was admittance into the UC. And certainly at the UC level, Latinos are finally faring a little bit better percentage-wise. However, not anywhere proportional to the community population. And we tend to be a community that's in the CSU system as opposed to the UC system. And so there's a number of implications there that are important. But fast forward to this past legislative session, the effort to repeal Prop 209 had been moving along, but not quickly, had struggled through the legislative process, was still meeting criticism. And then we have the murder of George Floyd. And the murder of George Floyd kicked a number of initiatives further along, faster along, including this one. And eventually we get Prop 16 on the ballot, but without a lot of pre-planning, long-term planning, advanced planning, approach to the campaign. And so it gets on the ballot very quickly with a really, sort of principally, initially, I should say, a San Francisco-based driving engine to this that had to reach out in other parts of the state. I will say that when you look at the results, Los Angeles County as a whole actually performed 10% more than the rest of the state. it actually passed in Los Angeles County. And that had not always been the case. So Los Angeles County trended a little differently, but I'll say this in terms of the campaign, and a lot of activists and community organizations try to blend the campaigns for Prop 15, which was something we all obviously all cared about here in this institution, along with Prop 16. But the funding principally, to support and campaign was a Prop 15 effort. But I think it was so important to understand that Prop 16 has a space in that, that there's a dual effort to try to move both initiatives. 15 fared better, didn't pass, but fared better. 16 looks like a tremendous loss statewide when you pull all the data together. There was one feedback that I thought was amazing to me, and that was some polling done within the Latino community. And when the ballot initiative, when Prop 16 at the title was read to Latino voters, they, for the most part, either took it in a negative way, didn't sort of process it well enough to understand that they would be willing to vote for it. But from the title to reading through the summary, right, where you actually explain what Prop 16 does, the support swang 25, 30 points. So there was a challenge in the campaign to express from ballot title to what the initiative actually does. So I'm going to say this, at least from when you look at the better approach, Latinos were very significantly in favor of this proposition with a deeper read. With the cursory title, it was kind of a 50-50 proposition here. And then I think the rest of the rest of the state and other demographics throughout the state were pretty much 60-40 against it. So Trustee Bolna mentioned that the Latinos community would have to turn out stronger in bigger ways, because this is a proposition that could have impacted them very appropriately. But there is a gap in ballot title, in ballot argument and presentation, and in being able to connect with the community. I'm not going to say that this shouldn't be viewed as like a nail in the coffin and to continue to really go after Prop 209, but I think from the legislative standpoint, when things are placed on the ballot, or from a signature gathering standpoint, we can't do another version of a Prop 209 repeal without having full buy-in and a fully targeted campaign to the Latino community.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vettis. Dr. Corner, I'll give you the next question. And it deals with the subject that you touched on earlier on data disaggregation. And it says that we don't, the person who's asked the question talks about the tracking of Cubans and other Latino populations. And I also would like to ask, and someone else chimed in, about Afro-Latinos. So any thoughts on how we've begun the disaggregation process now, but ways to broaden, because the Latino diaspora clearly is broad, very, very broad. Thoughts on disaggregation?
Yes. So it's important to know where the data come from. Currently, the data come from the application process, which is housed and run centrally through the State Chancellor's Office on CCC Apply. And so the data sets that we have fully composed are the ones that only show those 4 categories of Mexican, South American, Central American, and other Latino. However, we began to collect data through the State Chancellor's application process in winter of 2020 that include the categories that you're seeing in front of you, which would include those countries of origin that were just mentioned, Chancellor. Those data sets, because they're only about now 11 months old, do not have a full representation where we could present data with any fidelity. However, they will be that way soon. So it's an important element, and it's something that's being built right now. And we will have data on the fall 20 and the fall 21 entering cohort as it relates to these categories. And eventually, as new students enter, we'll have a full data set for our entire student population.
Okay.
And in terms of the Afro-Latino, there is an ability for students to declare multiple ethnicities, which is one of the larger growth groups in terms of our student demographics. And there is the opportunity to look at that in the data But I know that the question also asked as it relates to the survey, and that would be an important element that we would make sure that we covered.
Okay, thank you. Let me get the voice of Professor Tapia in the conversation. And I'd like to ask, Professor, you obviously lead the largest ethnic studies department in the district at East Los Angeles College, at ELAC. Share a little bit about your experience of the department, its courses, its programs, its services, your faculty, and its impact on the success of students at ELAC.
Thank you. And I was listening to a lot of the discussion, so I want to touch on a few things. But most definitely, it's interesting when in hearing the data and in thinking about how we have this large department, and that so much of LACCD's Latino faculty is actually contained within our department. It's really striking. One of the questions that I saw in the chat was really about, well, how is it that we were able to grow the way we did? And certainly there in the hiring, you certainly need to make a case that there is a need. I think one of the things that has benefited us, though, is that we are a freestanding department. We are an independent department. We're not housed in a larger department. So when it comes to hiring, opportunities for departments to hire, we would obviously have to take the initiative. I'd say in the last few years is when we've seen a lot of growth. With regard to our course offerings, our courses are courses that are pretty popular. Students take them. Part of what allows students to take those classes is that they do count for their transfer, their GE lower division transfer. And so that makes it attractive to be able to take a class in history, fulfill, let's say, your government or institutions requirement, and take it within our discipline. So that, I think, is one of the benefits. In terms of getting real data, that's something that I think would really be critical. There's larger studies out there that have looked at the role of ethnic studies, African American, Chicano Latino, Asian American, Native American studies programs. And the research shows that those are beneficial. When students take these classes, they not only do well, they don't only do well in our classes, but it actually brings them in. They feel a sense of connection, and they tend to do better in their classes in general. So that's one piece I think that we as a district could certainly explore, and I think it's an important piece. I think one of the things that's been very interesting is that in this current era, and we saw the data on COVID and how it's really impacted our students, and we see it in our enrollments. I have to say that within our department, our program, our classes, they're still well enrolled at census. So we've dropped like everybody else, but not too significantly. So that's something that there still seems to be this desire or this need for students to take our classes. The other thing I want to touch on, somebody brought it up about, all of these campuses are HSIs. And so one of the things about Hispanic serving institutions, and I think about the work of colleague Dr. Gina Garcia, who looked at Hispanic serving institutions. And one of the things that really is the direction that we need to take in our discussion is, are we Hispanic serving institutions, or are we simply Hispanic enrolling institutions? Because I think the serving is that piece that with this data, we really need to think about. How are we serving our students in a way that is allowing them to be successful? And you see pieces, bits, and I would really challenge us to explore those. I don't want to take up too much more time, but the other piece I think that is related to this is when we first got money from the state to do student equity. We'd always had student equity plans, but we didn't have, they didn't come with any money. And so several years ago, when it started coming with money, we were having these conversations. And I was fortunate enough to start working in student equity. And one of the questions that constantly came up is that as we identified equity gaps for Latinos, for example, the question of Prop 209 came up, right? When we were saying, okay, this money is to do targeted interventions, right, to reduce our equity gaps. I heard this in many meetings. It was very frustrating to say, well, we can't use money for these groups because that would go against Prop 209. When in fact, the money was specifically to target those groups that had the largest gaps. So for me, I think that that's something that we need to explore. And within a Chicano Studies department, the issue came up in the chat, right? Well, it's great that in ethnic studies programs we have this diversity, but what about, you know, in other departments and on other campuses? So that's just a little bit of kind of what I'm hearing. And these are questions that I think we need to explore further.
Okay, thank you, Professora, for that. One more data question, Ryan, then we'll go to the slide with the Mendez case to prompt some other thoughts and reactions as we look at that historical case. And this relates to, are we able to track, disaggregate, potentially support for our LGBTQ students? That is there a way to get an understanding of who they are, where they are, and to better ascertain what their needs are so that we indeed can support them? And so that's one piece. And the second piece on data is, do we have an opportunity to track by ethnicity student participants in programs like EOPS, TRIO, Puente, and the like?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the programs are our programs, we can definitely track that. EOPS, DSPS, CalWorks, anything where a student has that as part of their student record can easily be tracked. And in fact, the Milestone Project that was evidenced and used for these charts already has that information integrated. It would be a point and click away. The other ones like TRIO and HSI grant programs, you would have to look at their specific grant data because usually that data are collected outside of the student information system and would need to be looked at separately. In terms of our classifications with sexuality and our LGBTQIA plus population, we do have some data, but it's limited. As we indicated before, this comes from the state application process, and the state wasn't collecting that data on all students. They had an over 20 collection. And so that is also an incomplete data set, but I would refer people to the board resolution that Trustee Vela sponsored, and Trustee Vela, if you want to speak to that, I believe it was passed in October, and part of the resolution called on the state to do better data collection so that we would be able to use that data to identify populations and make sure interventions are established correctly.
Okay. All right, let's move now on.
That's actually a work in progress, and
Yeah.
I think we, are confined really a lot by, all of the different players where you have the federal government, the state, and even us collecting the data. And so we're trying to come to a place where we can do it efficiently, especially on LGBT, which is not, been traditional. But it is a goal of a committee, and it's certainly the goal of LACCD. And I think Vice Chancellor Corner has been advancing that together with the committee. So we'll report back on that, but that is a goal of ours for sure, to collect that data. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Vela. And for those who aren't aware, the Board of Trustees adopted earlier this fall the LGBTQIA+ a Bill of Rights that speaks to a whole series of interests and a whole series of research and areas of support that they were intending to provide for our students. So if you're interested in that subject area, please look to our website at laccd.edu, and you can draw down the Bill of Rights. It's quite forward-looking, very progressive, and something that we intend to do piece by piece. So, and thank you, Mr. Vela, for your absolute steadfast leadership toward the conclusion of that Bill of Rights, and to the advisory committee, the Chancellor's Advisory Committee, that helped to shape that over the last year. So moving forward, as we look at this particular slide now, most of you who are aware of who have taken educational classes or Chicano studies or courses in history may recognize the Mendez versus Westminster case. And in the Latino, Chicano community in particular, this becomes, is a landmark case from 1947. And it really just spells out where this notion that the U.S. Court of Appeals, I think it was the Ninth Circuit, they said that the forced segregation of Chicano students into separate Mexican schools was unconstitutional and unlawful under the Equal Protection Clause. So that now the landmark case, because it was the precursor in so many ways to the Brown v. Board of Education that took away the separate but equal clauses and practices in our country. So that becomes an incredibly important case, a landmark, and it starts to talk about the important notion of social integration and of supports that we need to provide to all students who are attending public schools. So, Dr. Buelna, I know that you and I have talked about this as well, and how important this case was and is from the standpoint of educational opportunity and educational practice. And it really, this is a case that most folks who aren't aware, Brown v. Board of Education gets a lot of important and necessary attention, but this was really the precursor really that emerged from the Latino community. Would you like to add a little more?
Well, folks will notice on the top the North Star, and that's just it's not a decorative thing right there. And Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez. Gonzalo was a farm worker. Felicitas, Gonzalo was Mexican-American. Felicitas was Puerto Rican. So this was a Mexican and Puerto Rican family. And I say North Star because Sylvia Mendez in the picture below is getting the Presidential Medal of Honor because she's the 9-year-old girl whose parents, because she was not allowed into the white school. And this is where, again, the concept of anti-Mexicanism comes in, because the schools were called Mexican and they were run down, and that's where less resources. So that's where you get again the anti-socialization against Latinos, or the use of Mexican and Puerto Rican, and a lot of the disaggregation that we're talking about. But specifically here, we put the picture of Felicitas and Gonzalo, because these two individuals without a formal education took down the entire educational establishment at that time on their own with minimal help. They hired an attorney during that time period, and ultimately they won. Then it went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, then the NAACP, then the Japanese American Leadership Institute, then MALDEF, then Thurgood Marshall jumped in and made the arguments to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal. Then Governor Warren, then California was the first state to desegregate schools, the first, and it was a lot of the arguments went to Brown v. Board of Education. So again, from a legal practice, Mendez was the first case. The family, and here's the thing that was very important, before Felicitas died, she asked her daughter to tell the story about the case, because the case was ignored, because then you had Brown v. Board of Education. But in terms of California, Latinos, Mexican Americans, and again, the disaggregation of that, and important to know that information, is that as we're looking at this data today, there's no way to look at the data and to not say that we have a massive disconnect and a massive failure on our part as a system. And it's important for folks to, as you're looking out to us, to see chancellor, trustees saying this, because this was the vision of Gonzalo and Felicitas, that the future generations would stand up for themselves and make those decisions. And we're talking about Prop 209. What would Gonzalo and Felicitas do? They would say, you know what, it failed, but we have to move on. There are a lot of things within our district that we can do without Prop 209 until the folks with more money up in Sacramento figure out how to actually pass it and include Latinos in the discussion. And that means, and for those looking at a discussion about Mexican Americans, Central Americans, other Latinos in higher education, they should Google El Plan de Santa Barbara. which identified, which was the first, after you kind of have Mendez, then you have the civil rights movement, El Plan de Santa Barbara. But as we're looking at how, as a district, there's no way, for instance, at Southwest College, at West LA College, you have 47% of the student body being Latino and only 14% of the employees. There's no way to look at that and say that that is a good thing. The question is, why is the bureaucracy allowing for that to happen, right? So Gonzalo and Felicitas took leadership. So as you're at Pierce College and the numbers are bad, and you're at Southwest and even at East and even at Mission, at Trade Tech, at Valley and Harbor and LACD, where are you as an individual with regard to leadership, right? What are we going to all do to fix these numbers? Mendez and Westminster and Gonzalo and Felicitas, to a certain extent, are our North Star. And that's why Chancellor and I organized this slide, to make sure that if Gonzalo and Felicitas could do it when they had no resources, no support, no recognition, we could do this.
Thank you, Dr. Wellna. Very well stated. And that is our charge. And we are duly charged. Thank you for that. And clearly, we have a responsibility to continue to move forward and follow that North Star. So thank you for that. Let me make answer a couple of, as we look at this policy implications and future directions discussion. We'll get to student outreach and student success initiatives in just a moment and get your thoughts on that. But let me answer, there's been quite a cluster of questions around hiring practices. How do we get more diverse faculty, staff into LACCD? What are we doing about that? Where are the resources? Let me just offer a few comments. As part of our framework for racial equity and social justice, one of the action steps that we identified and that we are engaged in right now is a wholesale review of our human resources and hiring practices that are governed by our HR unit as well as our personnel commission. We have amplified the EEOC committee or EEO committee that will look into our hiring practices, from recruitment, outreach, engagement. How do we draw people into our organizations, to the actual hiring process itself, the documentation, the paperwork, the screening, all those sorts of things, to the point of actual interviews and selection, promotion, support, all the way through. So you can see this, and it's a considerable amount of work that will be undertaken. The goal here is to extract, to identify, and root out those structural barriers that have left communities of color out, or women out, or other minoritized or other disenfranchised or vulnerable impacted communities. So that is the goal here, to say, have we inadvertently or advertently, for whatever reasons, and put in structural barriers that have not allowed the full representation of individuals to be interested, to apply for, and to be appropriately considered for professional positions at LACCD. So that is a huge charge. It is something that we're keeping a very close eye on and monitoring and supporting the advancement and success and engagement. And that discussion is a broad discussion with multiple stakeholders and constituency groups that are part of that. So we look forward to that work within the confines of what the current laws are, in the areas that we can be aggressive, in the areas that we can be creative, innovative, and supportive by way of outreach and engagement, and really kind of defining what excellence looks like. It's really important that some of those deficits that are in our history books, that are in the educational books, and things that describe our lived experience of being poor, of being first generation, of being an English language learner, of being the single parent, of being having a disability, of being from the LGBTQ community, all those that were considered and written and really purported as limitations are now assets, in my view, and should be viewed as assets of the lived experience, because those are precisely the lived experiences of the students that we serve. And having an engagement with, and having a knowledge of, awareness of, a lived experience with these types of experience is value added to the educational enterprise. And so in thinking about that, if one believes and supports that premise, how does that translate to the policies and practices and the questions and the vetting and of individuals who want to work with LACCD? We got, as you saw, several, thousands of employees, both full and part-time, who work with us. We want to ensure that we have the kinds of representation in the right places so that students can be successful and that we can teach in the classroom the kinds of education that will allow our students to be 21st century learners, 21st century contributors, 21st century workers. So that's something that we've got to move on. So I wanted to answer that sort of a general question here. The other piece is about ethnic studies, and that is part of our framework as well. And it's a considerable amount of discussion going on right now. It's an active discussion that's been ongoing. And as you know, our district put in and got an author, Assembly Member Marsucci, to support Assembly Bill 3310 that would have essentially legislated an ethnic studies requirement in the entire California community college system. That piece of legislation had to be shelved last year because of the necessary COVID emphasis, but we are looking to resurrect that this year. Well, interestingly, since then, and since last year, since when this piece of legislation was introduced for this cycle, ACA 5, which was referred to, and then now Assembly Bill 1460, sponsored by Shirley Weber, has been signed into law by the governor a few months ago, which requires the CSU to have an ethnic studies requirement as part of their graduation for the 23-24 graduating class. Now, they've not yet determined whether that class is upper division or it can be lower division or both. The statewide CSU system would like it to be a lower division requirement. If that holds, and if that remains to be true, what that requires is for those of us who are the sending institutions, the California community colleges, it requires that we indeed be prepared for the amount of courses, the amount of coursework, and students that could take this for the graduation requirement. As you're probably aware, 2/3 of our students who transfer go to the CSU, and the vast majority of our students who transfer go to one of 5 CSU campuses: Cal State LA, Cal State Northridge, Cal Poly Pomona, CSU Dominguez Hills, and CSU Long Beach. Our students are generally geo-bound. So the question for us, if that is going to be an exclusively lower division requirement, then are we prepared to have the coursework necessary to transfer students into the CSU? As you know, most students are using the ADT. More recently, the statewide academic senate supports this notion of ethnic studies as a general education requirement. They put in some resolutions this fall to support that, and our own district academic senate recently put in a resolution purporting the same kind of support for ethnic studies as a general education requirement here at LACCD. So the question is, how are we preparing ourselves? What kinds of need do we have? What kinds of coursework do we need to develop? Curriculum development, that's the purview of faculty. So there are many, many ethnic studies faculty on this call right now. So, we'll have future discussions clearly about how we resource that work, how we empower that work, and how we prepare ourselves for what we think is going to be an increased demand of classes in the 4 very specific and specified areas of Chicano Latino studies, African American Black studies, Native American Indigenous studies, and Asian American Pacific Islander studies. Those are the areas by which are defined formally as ethnic studies, and this is what the law states. So we've got some resource pieces that we've got to figure out. We've got course curriculum development that we have to figure out, and then find a way to get these courses in the hands of students so that they can be enrolled. Now, my last statement on this is this: we're uneven at LACCD. We have more Chicano studies, a little bit of Black studies, very little Asian studies, very little Native American Indigenous studies, very little of that. So we're in balance. Now, one could say, well, look at the student body it's proportionate to the student body. But the fact of the matter is we have very little Black studies and an interest in supporting, growing, and enrolling students into Black studies of all backgrounds. And then the other communities as well. So that is something that we're going to have to address, speak to our ethnic studies professors, experts on this to discuss that, talk to our curriculum experts about that, to our district academic senate experts about how we begin to shape an environment that is indeed proportionate to what I expect is going to be high demand. The California Community College Office has a request in to this year's budget that would allow for additional resources for ethnic studies faculty so that we could hire full-time or even part-time ethnic studies faculty to begin that, what we believe is going to be a strong interest of all students to take ethnic studies courses. So I wanted to stop there and see if any panelists had any reactions or what, Dr. Bona, was that you?
Yeah, that's me. I do want to mention, as we're looking at this disaggregation of data, right? Because over the years and how we look at the Latino category and how we look at all the subcategories, right? And what I think what folks are getting or looking at is that the whole, the big Latino category isn't serviced as long as the subparts are not serviced. As an example, we don't know, Jocelyn Duarte from ELAC asked a question about Central American faculty. We don't know that information. Central Americans, like Dr. Coroner said, are the third largest ethnic group, white, Mexican American, Central American. We don't know how many Central American faculty, administrators, staff, because the Latino category masked it. So we're not able to get to that level. And that's where, we're, a lot of us on the panel do have a background in Chicano studies and understand the importance. Even if you look, for instance, at this last election, Latino groups voted at different levels. So understanding a Latino vote, it's impossible because it doesn't exist. So as we look at the disaggregation of data, someone asked about Cuban Americans, about Afro-Latinos. In the new approach to doing it, which is looking at this aggregate, we would be able to have those answers specifically. And then one of Mike Fong and former trustee Ang actually pushed this along when they were looking at the disaggregation of data. And trustee Fong, I think, really characterized it when he said, I think there was a discussion among 40, among students, and they weren't a percentage, and he really advocated. We will get down into the data into micro Latino groups. In Los Angeles, we have large Oaxacan communities and different indigenous communities that we need to understand that data, because when you have 61% Latino, if you don't understand the micro groups, you're not serving the bigger group. So I wanted to also answer Ms. Duarte's, and I think, Chancellor, you have some upcoming, the goal of this meeting today was to get the data out there, then the moving into your new committee.
Yes, yeah, thank you, sir. Let me announce that. Beginning in January, we're going to shape a Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Central American, Mexican American, and Latino affairs. That's good. That will take up a lot of the questions that I see in the chat here. I'm so glad that we're recording this, that we're recording your very insightful comments, questions, and observations. So we will charge that committee with looking into some of this work in similar fashion as to the other Chancellor's Advisory Committees that we at the district and the board has completely endorsed and co-chaired with us around Black African American student affairs, Asian Pacific Islander affairs, and LGBTQ. So we're going to move forward on that. We'll call out how folks could be involved. We will be calling for very specific expertise, have subgroups that deal with the subjects of ethnic studies and other areas, representation, student success, and forward. So we're shaping that now, but in consultation with our board, they're very interested in us continuing and bolstering, fortifying, if you will, the engagement and a structure by which we could move expeditiously into these areas. So yes, again, so you'll see an announcement on that next month related to the new Chancellor's Advisory Committee that supports this particular area. So we've got about 6 minutes left here. Let me just ask any of our panelists if they have any, Dr. or Professor Tapia, I see your hand, and we'll let you go first, please.
Yes, I was just going to say, and looking at the questions in the chat, the data is really, really important. Part of, one of the questions that came up earlier in the chat was, how we managed to grow our own department and program. Part of what we've done is, and certainly one of the previous chairs before I became chair, really looked at the data, and we were working with our Office of Institutional Effectiveness to get data to figure out, what do our demographics look like? And it was as a result of that, and it was Professor Eddie Flores who really moved on this, was to think about how do we grow smartly. And so one of the areas that we looked at was to look at our demographics. Out of that, we our department created Central American Studies classes, and we were doing this because obviously Northridge, Cal State Northridge has a program, and realized that there was a need. And so when looking at the data, we realized, wow, how do we as a Chicano Studies department grow? Now, there was some discussion, certainly, but the idea was that this was a population that we serve who were taking our classes, but how interesting for them to be able to take classes that maybe reflected their experiences a little bit more. The other area where we began creating classes was Chicano LGBTQ studies. We have three courses. We have a Chicano LGBTQ lit class. We have a Chicano LGBTQ history class. And so it really was utilizing this data. And I think that's why it's so important to figure out, how do we then move forward? How do we grow? And the idea behind the growth is not just to serve our students, but also to think about, as a program, where are we going to see our hiring needs? Where are we going to decide that we need to hire somebody to teach in these areas? So that's just something I think that's really important in terms of how do we use this information to grow and to make ourselves more in line with serving our students. I think that's one of the ways that we've done it, and we are happy to see the district move in this direction, though a lot of that work takes place on the campus level, I have to say. But it's great when we have that support and that push coming from different directions.
Okay, any other panelists, concluding remarks?
That's right.
President.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to all the participants and people viewing in. I really appreciate chats and question and answer. I got a chance to survey a few of them. There's so many good things there, and want to make sure we capture all those things to follow up on that engagement that all of you had is so critical and important and valuable. I wanted to offer a few comments, and these are things that I hope we take up later in the committee, Chancellor. But let me start off by talking about this question of that you've taken up in our social justice and equity efforts, bias or pipeline challenges. I think oftentimes when it comes to hiring, there's always this question of, is the pipeline robust enough? But I think at the same time, with this institution, with the number of qualified trained people of color out there, we have to look deeply into bias as well, and to not understand the gaps closing as quickly as they should have. 4% over the last, was it 10 years? I think was the chart that 20 years, I think is the chart that was mentioned there is a real problem. But I want to dig and have us dig deeply into the bias question. And then if we can get a full understanding of the pipeline, because there may be areas as an institution and we can help support. I want to be akin to the Leadership Training Institute you've done for our executives. There may be more of that mentoring and training we could do. We can play a more substantial role, but at the same time, all of that training means nothing if there's bias. So that's one thing. And I am very hopeful with our new Personnel Commission Director. He has demonstrated lots of care and attention, at least for our classified ranks, but plenty more work needs to happen amongst our teaching ranks. So the second thing is, I know we've had a great conversation about ethnic studies and the role of ethnic studies and the importance of ethnic studies, but I also want to underscore the fact that, we all have HSI designations.
Mhm.
And what does that really mean? I mean, these are people of color institutions by high percentages, Latino institutions by high percentages. What does that mean? What are the contexts of that kind of effort? We do something very very positive for our Black students here in terms of connecting to historically Black colleges. There is an identity, there is a cultural and racial connection and pride that's developed in those institutions. We absolutely support our students being able to be connected and exposed there. There isn't much equivalent to historically Black colleges in the Latino community. And I think that deserves a greater conversation of what that might look like. Language, we haven't, beyond a couple of comments about potentially indigenous languages, we haven't had a great conversation about language as a whole, bilingualism, multilingualism as assets. And, oftentimes that's a challenge of this country. But we may actually want to think about how our service providers, counselors and outreach folks and all those kinds of things where bilingualism is absolutely embraced as a feature. Because I know, growing up in a household that was multilingual in itself, there's often challenges trying to find the right words to express the things that you need to do. And for a time point in many of our histories, that was negative, as opposed to being viewed as positive, that you have so many different influences and impacts in your life. And the final thing I'll mention is I really appreciate sort of at least the initial data segregation in terms of our students and recognizing the Central American community that we have here. Beyond Central American studies, there's also advocacy for the Central American community that's sometimes a bit different than just the advocacy that we've had as a whole. I know we've spent plenty of time dealing with DACA, but we didn't actually spend a whole bunch of time dealing with TPS and really specific things that might connect to the Central American community, and the fact that we also have children of children that come from countries with a civil war and different kinds of challenges than, say, Mexico in itself. Those things I don't want to sort of leave out of the conversation. They're critical and they're important. And I think it's a valuable piece to our advocacy, legislative advocacy. And certainly everything we do in Washington, D.C., we can layer in the very specific pieces that are unique to Central American students, essentially being our third largest demographic here, community-wise in LACCD. I think it's important to elevate that to a higher point on our agenda. So with that, again, on my behalf, seeing the questions and the comments, keep them coming. This is great, and it's really important. And I think we need to fully embrace this dialogue in a very significant way at the board, and as potential policies and budgeting prioritizations and all those things come forward. I think this is going to be an exciting endeavor to really embrace the fact that these are people of color institutions, Latino institutions, and can have a significant impact not only in Los Angeles, but certainly throughout the United States here. So thank you, Chancellor, and look forward to the continued dialogue.
Thank you, President Mendez. I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time and simply announce that this session was indeed recorded and can be made available to the participants of today's session. We will monitor and take down every single question that was here as part of the documentation for this meeting that will inform the future work of the committee as we move forward. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that as we are moving forward. This was intended to be, another step in the dialogue for the discussion of the status of Latinos at LACCD, and we will have more for this community as well as for other communities as we look towards becoming a more racially integrated, socially just academic institution. So Dr. Corner, let me thank you for the data. For your team. Yes.
Just if I could take 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
Okay. As Latinos, we can see in terms of our majority of the students, and in terms of representation statewide, we've seen that Latinos have become not minority, but now majority, and how these institutions are governed properly through the democratic process. I think though people have asked how to participate in the upcoming Central American, Mexican American, and Latino community group that you're organizing, and I would urge them at your campus level, have discussions with the president, the dean, the president, deans, vice presidents, and your organizing units, not units as in labor, but in terms of individuals and groups and conversations, are an important part to moving those conversations over to the new committee that you organized, because this will not improve unless the entire body is participating. And I just, I didn't know if David Vela wanted to say anything in his final words, but thank you, Chancellor, for putting this together. I'm looking forward to your new committee.
Thank you, Vice President Buela. And, I think part of it, and I know it's really important as we move forward on the intersectionality of, our curriculum and our courses. And, I think, Beatriz mentioned LGBT, obviously, and Chicano studies merging and intersecting. But I think one of the things we can learn is that, and a lot of the studies that are done by the state and the state legislature with the recent, approval of that piece of legislation, is that it also expands our way into economic activity. And so, you have the opportunity to merge, for example, film, television, other aspects with our ethnic studies and Chicano studies, and in particular, with our local economy. And that's exciting. That's something that I think we can learn a lot from this data, and, we can integrate industries, as well. And so I think it's a positive thing, as well as, all the other Latino communities can benefit from that. And we're seeing that. We're seeing it happen naturally, but wouldn't it be great to have that intersection here at LACCD? So, and I think we're continuing in the right path. And I want to also thank President Hoffman for being here, and she's a fierce advocate for the Latino community as well. So just wanted to thank her for all the support for what we've been doing here, in particular with looking at data. Thank you all.
Trustee Hoffman, any concluding comments? You're going to be the final word today, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today.
Oh, she's with us.
I enjoyed the discussion. I did put a comment in the chat, and I think as we look at data around hiring, let's not forget our student workers and make sure that they're included in that data, because I do get a lot of, I think there even was a comment today about how students are able to get jobs on campus, and if we take race and ethnicity into consideration, and we certainly can when we hire student workers. So that's a place that we can start. So let's just not forget about our students that rely on that extra income while they're studying.
That's right.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I was going to call you board president.
Okay, maybe I should just stop showing up.
No.
Called me president.
We do employ between 27 and 2,800 student workers at LACCD, so it is a significant number. And as you recall, during this COVID period, we have done everything we could to keep them on board and employed, so that they can receive their wages, at least for that period of time, to get them over that very difficult period. So thank you for your leadership on that, and the rest of the Board of Trustees. So on behalf of President Verez, Vice President Buelna, Vice President Vela, Trustee Hoffman, Vice Chancellor Corner, Professora Tapia, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this morning. I bid you a good rest of your day and a wonderful holiday coming up. Feliz Navidad to everybody. Feliz Año Nuevo. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the new year. Okay, take care, everyone. Hasta luego.
Thank you.
Where could they find this, Chancellor?
Dr. Corner?
Dr. Corner, this is going to have 1 million views. I just want to make sure. Maybe we should put some advertising so we can earn some income.
We will post it to the EPI website once it's available for download with captioning, and then we'll work with the marketing team to make sure people know where it's at.
On YouTube, on our YouTube channel?
Wherever we can. The
Okay.
recording can be posted wherever we can post it.
All right, thank you. Looking forward to that.
All right,
We had 170 up to 178 at its max.
fantastic. Congratulations. Wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful. And the questions,